When a bullet is manufactured, nobody knows where it'll go.
Steven Seagal was once described as an enigma wrapped in a riddle inside a puzzle.
Writer Lawrence Grobel.
He is an enigma wrapped in a riddle inside a puzzle. He could clear up a lot of things if he wanted to, but I don't think he does want to.
The man has brushed shoulders with the Dalai Lama, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump. He may claim a more colored past than a Tom Clancy novel. He has been jokingly called the next Andy Kaufman. From lying about being in the CIA.
You actually have a job with the Central Intelligence Agency.
I like the way you say that. Well, you know, it's kind of a personal thing, Dave. It's a little it's tough to talk about this.
You can't talk about it? So that means you were with the CIA. Because if you weren't, you could talk about anything you wanted.
Well, if you want to put it that way, it's pretty embarrassing, and I wouldn't like to talk about it because it's kind of a painful memory, you know.
I'll ask you one more time, and then I'm going to hit you with a snowball.
One time, when I had a relationship with those people, I was assigned to an airport in Miami, and I was there to monitor the movement of a certain faction of a very militant group from one of those Arab countries, and I had a desk there and wanted everything to be really tranquil so that I could, you know, have what we would call a calm theater for
low profile.
Optimum operating conditions.
Exactly.
And an elderly lady brought a dog in. You know, they have those dogs in those little plastic
the
cages.
big kennel flight carrier.
Yeah,
sure.
and she said, "Can I just leave this here for a minute? I got to go do something." And I said, "Sure." You know, nice guy that I am. And so I said to myself, you know, if I want to be like really a sophisticated spook, I gotta like, you know, operate and think quick. And I sent one of my people, I mean, this was a typical little Bichon, you know, there's little white poodles, they all look alike. So I said, you know, there's a pet shop 30 minutes from here. Go get a live dog, we'll swap collars, she'll never know the difference.
It's a great move, excellent idea.
And I figured this way I keep my job, you know, so that I can be effective, and everything was great. And we did it successfully. A couple hours later, she comes back, and I figured, well, let's make this a little theatrical. And I opened the cage, and the dog came running out with its collar on, looked just exactly alike.
Yeah.
And she sees the dog, screams and faints. And we went over and we started, you know, calling paramedics and stuff and revived her. And when I was talking to her, I said, what happened? And she said, well, I was bringing the dog back here for burial. I don't know how he came back to life. And then they fired me. They fired me.
That never happened. That didn't happen. We have to do a commercial. We'll be right back here with Steven Seagal.
To fighting the Yakuza in his youth in Japan.
重曹面白かったね、重曹。
暴れましたね。
なんで？
いや、その乱暴のところに入ってきたらね、その時々悪い人の人をいじめたりね、いろいろこうかけてくるでしょう。我々はもう喜んでね、そういう
歓迎したね。
We're happy to oblige that.
From meeting Bruce Lee to predicting Brandon Lee's death.
That's how I met Bruce Lee, was through James.
Tell me, I was going to ask. So you met Bruce Lee. Tell me about your experiences with Bruce and what was he like and how did you get on with him?
You know, I wasn't around Bruce much. He was the kind of guy who kind of would badmouth most, a lot of the other martial artists and martial arts in a kind of a sarcastic way, fun way, which I understood. For some reason, he never had anything bad to say about me, and I was quite interested in Aikido, and he was very nice to me. He knew that I grew up in Asia and that I had a son that was just exactly the same age as Brandon. And when I met Brandon, he had lighter hair and said, "This is my little Caucasian boy," you know. You know, I thought Bruce was a really great guy, really cool guy. When Brandon was killed like that, they called me a few minutes after it happened. It was in Carolina somewhere. They called me in the middle of the night and they said, "We think that he's dead, but the guy shot a blank gun at him. How could he be dead? He's dying. He's you know, severely hurt, maybe dead." And I said, "You will find a projectile in him. You'll find a bullet in him." And they said, "That can't be. You're crazy." And I said, you will find a bullet in him. And they called me in the morning. They said, you're amazing. And I said, why? And they said, there was a bullet in him.
Wow.
And I can go through the whole story on what really happened, which most people don't know, but...
From getting confused as to his ethnicity.
I'm a little bit Asian and I'm Russian. Yeah, I have some Italian on my mother's side.
I'm Russian. My family are from Vladivostok and Belarus.
I don't know what color I am.
I mean, I'm not white, but...
Okay.
I'm
non-Japanese.
Yeah, my mother was American Indian and my father's a Russian Mongol, so I'm Asian. I don't know what the hell I am, but...
From being a blues player to owning a massive guitar and sword collection.
He started his most beloved collection.
I probably had 10 to 12 swords that were, within the history of Japan, amazingly important and significant.
But swords aren't his only passion. He also has a collection of almost 300 guitars.
He may have assaulted more women than the man has had good films.
Star of the Jefferson Parish-based reality series, Steven Seagal lawman and a reserve JP deputy, is being sued by a woman who claims he used her as a sex toy. My story is all new tonight.
2 more women are coming forward today claiming actor Steven Seagal sexually assaulted them.
The man has had his fingers in more than people realize, for making his own energy drink.
Hey there, we want to tell you about Steven Seagal's new energy drink. It's called Lightning Bolt. It's 100% natural and it tastes just great.
To meal replacements. From helping to create aromatherapies to sponsoring swords and guns. From being in low-budget booze ads to endorsing the 2014 invasion of Crimea.
Tough guys, I am a tough guy. And now I'm getting ready for my toughest role yet. You. Carlton Dry wants to make the movie of your most funny or exciting story. Starring me as you.
Steven Seagal may at one time been a master of Aikido, but with a history as checkered as his, is it possible to separate the art from the artist? This is the tip of the iceberg. Join me as we deep dive and examine the real man, not just the image he wants to project, using sources from over the years and checking that against the countless retcons Seagal has made. This is the Steven Seagal documentary. Where do you start with an enigma like Steven Seagal? It's simplest to start at the beginning. Steven Frederick Seagal was born April 10th, 1952, in Lansing, Michigan. Steven was born to Patricia and Samuel Seagal. It is important to state that over the years, Seagal is notorious for getting confused as to his ethnicity. Here's what I've uncovered about his familiar ties. Steven's father, Samuel, was born Samuel Siegelman. Samuel was born to Russian Jewish immigrants. Steven's paternal grandfather, Nathan Siegelman, was born in Babryansk, which is now modern-day Belarus. Side note, Seagal's last name was originally pronounced Seagal, but after Seagal had went to an art exhibit featuring Marc Chagall, he was so moved he changed the pronunciation of his last name. Nathan and his wife were Ashkenazi Jews. Steven's mother, on the other hand, was born to English-German parents. Growing up, Steven was a frail young man and always sickly. When Steven was 5, his parents moved to Fullerton, California. Steven's mother, Patricia, once told People magazine that, quote, before the move to California, Steven was frail and suffered from asthma, end quote. In that quote, he was a puny kid back then, but he really thrived after our move from Michigan, end quote. During an interview with The Art of Action, he once told a story of how he first encountered Aikido.
The beginning is I was with my father in Michigan. I was born in Michigan, right outside of Detroit. And my father was the football coach, and at the halftime of a football game, do you even know what that is, a halftime? Probably not, because you're British.
Yeah.
No, you do know what it is.
It's the same in England, soccer.
Okay, great. So at a halftime, they showed this little man. He set these mats out there, and he started beating up on and throwing people around and throwing them around like pieces of paper. And I went crazy. I said to my father, I said, Daddy, that's what I was born to do. I was probably about 5 years old at that time.
By the age of 13, Seagal said he was training daily. Martial arts weren't Seagal's only passion. Around this time, he began playing guitar. John Stewart, writer of Action Film magazine, was quoted as saying,
if he wasn't in the dojo, he was out in the garage practicing the guitar.
Seagal went on to attend Bueno Park High School in Bueno Park, California, then went on to attend Fullerton College in late 1970.
Instead, Steven enrolled at Fullerton College in Southern California.
but Seagal dropped out after a few weeks.
Side note, in past interviews, Seagal has stated that he went to Japan when he was 17 or 18. This is false. He went to Japan when he was 22.
I always had a dream to be able to go over to the Far East and study, and by the time I was 17, 18, I just went over there and ended up staying.
Seagal would continue to practice Aikido while working minimum wage jobs to support himself. Then, in 1974, Seagal would meet his soon-to-be first wife, Miyako Futanani. Futanani was, at the time, a second-degree black belt and the daughter of an Osaka Aikido master. Miyako was in California for a martial arts competition.
Know about his personality, but he looked nice. His voice was nice too.
Steven and Miyako were inseparable while she was in the US, so when she went back to Osaka, Steven followed.
He was either in love with her, enamored with her, or felt this was an opportunity for him to change his life. And she went back to Japan, and when he did, he followed her.
Seagal, who is an unreliable narrator when it comes to timelines, claimed in a 1991 interview with Movie Line that he had married Futanani because she was pregnant. But in a 1995 interview with Spy Magazine, Futanani lays out the timeline. Quote, I met Steven in California in the fall of 1974. He followed me back to Japan in October. We got married in December of 1974. Our first child was born October 1975. End quote. By 1976, the Tenshin dojo was struggling to stay afloat. Steven was convinced he could turn the failing dojo around. In the summer of 1976, after some heavy convincing and some hesitation from Seagal's mother-in-law, he was made the director of the dojo.
Own the Tenshin dojo. Foreigners cannot own property, but they can co-own as if you marry a Japanese.
This incident led to the misconception that he was the first non-Asian to open a dojo in Japan.
The first white man to teach Aikido and have his own dojo in Japan. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not...
So completely, he became the first foreigner to open a dojo.
In 1975, he became the first Westerner to open his own dojo in Japan.
With martial arts, more than just a passing interest.
Oh yeah, I became the first non-Oriental to teach over there in the history of Japan. I taught over there for a long time.
His mother-in-law owned the dojo, his wife ran the day-to-day business, and Seagal simply taught there. In the interview with Spy Magazine, Miyako had some insight into Seagal's title as the first non-Asian to receive a black belt in Aikido. Quote, the only reason Steven was awarded the black belt was because the judge, who was famous for his laziness, fell asleep during Steven's presentation, end quote. She goes on to say that, quote, the judge just gave him the black belt, end quote.
In the summer of 1976, 24-year-old Steven became director of the Tenshin dojo.
It was extremely unique for a Westerner to be able to teach in ethnocentric Japan. Here you had a white man from Orange County.
Seagal has boasted of his courage in battling criminals. Seagal was quoted as saying, quote, sometimes the thugs are members of the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. Other times they are merely garden variety criminals, end quote. Seagal told Movie Line, I jumped right in their faces. I was a tenacious man. I was fearless. Futanani told Spy, it is a lie. Quote, he once chased a few drunks away from the dojo, but was never involved with the Yakuza, end quote. After a slow and rocky start by 1977, Seagal had begun to make a name for himself in Osaka. Seagal didn't want to be known as just an Aikido expert. He aspired to becoming a writer.
I thought I would take a couple of years in America to do music, healing, martial arts, and writing. So they handed me 2 or 3 scripts and they said, you know, make any of these you want. I read them. I came to America as a writer. And
you got it. My dream was to be one of the best martial artists in the world. That was my dream.
Certainly you can see that.
During an interview for a 2003 biography on Steven Seagal, security specialist and friend of Steven's, Tom Mazzilla, says,
he really wanted to focus on his film career to really show this type of martial art to the American public and show the mentality and consciousness of a martial artist in films, how they would utilize that art. And Aikido was probably the best way he could do that.
In 1978, Steven had handpicked a group of his best students to accompany him for demonstrations around the world. Seagal's group primarily performed at entertainment events. Actor Harry Dean Stanton met Seagal at one of these events in London.
I remember him sitting on the floor with his arms folded, and 5 guys got behind him, trying to move him. They couldn't move him.
Over the next few years, Seagal would continue to tour around the US and Europe. Even with all of Seagal's efforts, he still hadn't made any headway as a writer or as an actor. Finally, in 1981, Steven's luck changed. Producers had arrived in Japan to begin pre-production on a martial arts film titled The Challenge.
Choreographer and the name Steven Seagal kept coming up, and they didn't take him seriously because he was an American. And then they talked to several Japanese sword masters, and they said, no, he is quite legitimate, and you'd better check this guy out.
They decided to travel to Seagal's dojo to see him in action. After seeing Seagal in action, he was hired to choreograph all the fight scenes. Seagal was hooked from that moment. Fall of the same year, Seagal decided to hop on a plane for the US and not look back, leaving behind Miyako and his 2 children in pursuit of his dreams. During an interview, Miyako Futanani spoke as to why she believes Seagal wanted to go to America to make movies.
Through the study of Aikido, we can make the world better. And that's why Steven wanted to go to America, to spread the spirit of Aikido. I think that was the motivation for him to be in the movies.
Seagal's first stop was Taos, New Mexico, where he and then student Craig Dunn, later stuntman in some of Seagal's films, opened a dojo together.
He did one first in New Mexico, and then he opened up a later dojo in Los Angeles.
The first time you hear about Seagal in America upon his return is in 1982, in the September-October edition of Coming Attractions, in which they claim Seagal was, quote, recognized in Japan a Shihan, or Master of Masters of the Combat Arts, end quote. During the next year, Seagal would balance his New Mexico dojo with continuing to try and score parts in Hollywood. With almost a year back in the United States and no acting or writing roles coming Seagal's way, he was strapped for cash.
Came down with a bad case of Hollywood fever. The Aikido master arrived in California, set on becoming the biggest martial arts star since Bruce Lee.
People didn't even know he had a Japanese wife.
By the summer of 1982, Seagal was desperate for cash. Movie roles were impossible to come by, and Steven found it hard to support himself.
But that's when Seagal used the last of his wife's savings to open a second dojo in North Hollywood. Then shortly after, moving the dojo to West Hollywood, where Seagal hoped to attract higher clientele. Over the rest of 1982 and into 1983, Seagal would fly between his 2 stateside dojos.
Despite his hard work, Steven's dojos barely turned a profit. Back in Osaka, Seagal's wife Miyako also struggled.
As the dojos were barely scraping by, and Miyako was beginning to struggle with handling all of the household business, on top of the day-to-day business at the Tenshin dojo, Seagal needed cash quick.
I supported him by taking care of the children and the business at the office. I didn't want him to be worried about these things, so I did it all myself.
Then, in 1983, Seagal saw himself working with one of the biggest names in Hollywood during this time, Sean Connery. Seagal was training Connery in Aikido for the upcoming James Bond film, Never Say Never Again. While training with Seagal one afternoon, Seagal broke Connery's wrist.
That one. But a number of years ago with a guy who's become very successful, Steven Seagal.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, we're going to do a film called Never Say Never Again, and there was a possibility I was going to do Aikido and what have you, and I got a hold of Steven, and we had this training in the building where I had an apartment, and he was really very, very good and everything. And then I got a little cocky because I thought I knew what I was doing, because, you know, the principle is it's defense, so it's a pyramid, and I got a bit flash, and I did that, and he broke my wrist.
Wow.
And, oh yeah, and it was so well put together here, I still have it broken.
Is it still broken?
Yeah, that's 15 years ago.
And it's still broken?
Yeah, I just found out last year.
Seagal was just enjoying it, being in Southern California and having a good time and meeting lots of women.
During 1983, Seagal returned to Japan not to help his struggling dojo or to help his wife with his children, but to hand Miyako divorce papers.
Miyako and her children hadn't seen Steven in almost 2 years, but the homecoming was not a happy one.
I thought it was strange. Then when he returned, he suddenly told me about the divorce.
And Miyako's autobiography, My Aikido, the last words Steven said to her were, quote, "You're crazy. I want a divorce," end quote. Steven then left his kids and hopped on a plane back to LA, where Seagal had begun kindling a relationship with actress Adrienne LaRussa, who was starring in the soap opera Days of Our Lives. May 31st, Steven Seagal married Adrienne LaRussa, even though Seagal was still legally married to Miyako back in Japan. It didn't take long, however, before Steven's wandering eye turned towards actress and model Kelly LeBrock. In an interview with writer John Connolly, he details Seagal's infatuation with LeBrock.
Well, Steven Seagal was still married to wife number 1 and wife number 2. He saw Kelly LeBrock and went to an aged friend of his and said, how can I get to meet her?
Joe Haim remembers Seagal saying that Kelly LeBrock was his destiny after seeing her in the 1984 Gene Wilder picture, Woman in Red. Haim, who was friends with LeBrock's former agent, Jerry Pam, arranged a dinner in which Seagal could meet Pam. Haim recalls during dinner, Seagal asked Pam what was the best way to get publicity. Pam told him the best way was to be seen in the company of somebody famous. Later during dinner, Seagal asked if Pam could help him meet Kelly LeBrock. Pam told Seagal that LeBrock was in Japan. While Seagal was planning his move on LeBrock, his second wife, Adrienne LaRussa, discovered that her husband was still married to Miyako Futanani. LaRussa had the marriage annulled due to Steven's bigamy. LaRussa, however, did not seek any type of support from Seagal, and in fact, in a spy interview, not only did I not ask for anything, but I gave him money for months afterwards just to get him out of my life, end quote. She went on to say, quote, I can't say very much because I'm afraid of Steven and his friends, end quote. Spring of 85 was when Seagal made his move.
In the spring of 1985, Seagal learned Kelly was in Tokyo on business.
He just went and saw Kelly LeBrock and just stayed on her tail as much as possible.
Steven, after his meeting with Pam, knew that Kelly was going to be in Tokyo on business. Seagal, seeing an opportunity, arranged for a meeting between Seagal and LeBrock in Kelly's hotel room. Writer Lawrence Grobel details the encounter.
Seagal was friends with LeBrock's former agent, Jerry Pam. Pam arranged a meeting between Kelly and Steven in LeBrock's hotel room.
He came to the door, she looked through the peephole and said, that's a really ugly man. And then she opened the door and said, well, he's not as ugly as he was through the peephole.
Despite Steven's extracurricular activities, his Hollywood dojo was beginning to attract an impressive group of celebrity students. Names include James Mason and Gregory Peck.
Do private teachings in meditation and the martial arts and stuff. And one of the people who came to learn from me in Europe one time was James Mason. I didn't ask him to teach me acting, but everything I would teach him in meditation or philosophy or Zen or the martial arts, he would always compare it to acting.
Another one of those celebs was Michael Ovitz. Michael Ovitz was a major producer and agent at the time.
Opened a dojo in Los Angeles and attracted a lot of Hollywood heavyweights, Sean Connery, James Coburn, and super agent Michael Ovitz, who represented the hottest stars. Ovitz knew a good thing when he saw one.
Tom Mazzilla describes the start of Steven and Michael's unlikely friendship.
Steven and him shared a number of ideas and stories and information back and forth, and which eventually developed in a potential story and idea to present to the corporate executives at Warner.
Ovitz first scored Seagal a $50,000 screen test that ended disastrously. John Connolly explains.
Screen test, the $50,000 screen test. Seagal's voice came off very whiny, very scratchy, and if you look at him run, he runs like a woman.
Ovitz, not deterred by the failed test, set up a second meeting with higher-ups at Warner Brothers. This time, he knew that if he showcased Seagal's Aikido skills, that would seal the deal.
But Ovitz didn't give up. The agent insisted that Sema watch Seagal perform a demonstration of his Aikido skills.
He brought in some of his best Aikido students. He tossed them all around, and they were justifiably impressed.
No one had ever seen that before. It was more punching and kicking in the head or getting punched, but never being really thrown across the room dynamically and explosively. That looked just like phenomenal.
Steven brought in his best students, tossed them around in front of the executives, and they were wowed.
Good thing when he saw one. He had Steven do an Aikido demonstration for the head of Warner Brothers Studio, Terry Semel.
Little did the executives know, the stunt was rehearsed prior to them coming to Warner Brothers. In March of 1987, Steven Seagal signed a deal with Warner Brothers to produce an action film. During Seagal's negotiations, there was a looming writer's strike. Warner Brothers knew they would need to fast-track the script to ensure that the film would go into production on time. Warner Brothers was going to assign multiple writers. Seagal, sensing his chance, asked Warner Brothers to help write the script. They agreed and added Steven Pressfield, Legend of Bagger Vance and Free Jack, along with Ronald Schuett, writer of Alien, Aliens, and Total Recall, to help Seagal.
I kind of came here as a writer, and how about this, and how about that? You like this? And they said, yeah, we like this stuff, it's great, but we want you in front of a camera.
Terry offered him 3 action scripts, told him to pick one, and they'd go make a movie.
I read all 3 and I said, you know, Terry, these are all great stories, but I've got better stories. And they said, tell me one. I told them one. They said, we love that story. I said, well, can I write it for you? They said, yeah. I'd like you to write it with another writer so we can move fast. And at that time, we picked a team. We wrote Above the Law together. Going on, he's got the charisma, he's got the look, he's got the action. We feel confident after that. And so they handed me 2 or 3 scripts, and they said, you know, make any of these you want. I read them. I came to America as a writer. And I didn't like any of them. I said, you know, I think we can do better than this. And they said, well, there's a writer's strike coming up, so maybe if you want to write something. And I said, yeah, I want to write something. And they said, well, there's a writer's strike coming up, and the timing is going to be difficult if you don't write it quickly. Can we assign some folks to help you? I said, sure. And they assigned me Steven Pressfield and Ronnie Shusett. And together we all wrote Above the Law, yeah.
Following months, Seagal's divorce to Miyako was finalized. Miyako received custody of their 2 children, and Seagal was ordered to pay $500 a month in child support, roughly $1,200 today. With his first wife legally out of the picture and his second marriage annulled, Seagal was free to marry Kelly LeBrock.
The couple tied the knot in September 1987.
With Seagal wrapping up loose ends in his past relationships, and with the fast approaching release of Above the Law, Warner Brothers wasted no time getting Seagal's name in the press as the next big martial arts action film star.
Interest in a person who could go from 0 to star in 6 seconds.
While Seagal was promoting Above the Law, Seagal claimed that parts of the film were autobiographical and based on his experience with the CIA.
There are certain elements of the story that are very autobiographical, and there are other elements that are Hollywood fantasy. And I've worked with those people from time to time, but that was a long time ago.
He later changes his story when asked during an interview with The Voice on Access TV. Seagal says,
in interviews you've said that Above the Law was part autobiographical in segments.
Well, I'm not going to get into that, but I will say that I believe it was based on a true story which had to do with the Iran-Contra, you know, conspiracy, which really never came out.
While out promoting the film, Seagal began the rumor that he had ties to the CIA. When talking to the Los Angeles Times, he had told them that while teaching Aikido in Japan, he claimed that some of his students worked for the agency and that he had a CIA godfather. He then vaguely claims he was an, quote, advisor to several CIA agents in the field, and through my friends in the CIA, met many powerful people and did special works and special favors, end quote. Tom Mazzilla unconvincingly tries to lie during an interview to help Seagal save face.
Steven had been around a lot of elite military groups or professionals like Special Forces, SEALs, Ranger people, CIA people.
Above the Law opened in box offices April 22nd, 1988, bringing in an estimated $18.8 million against a $7.5 million budget.
Steven Seagal was a star.
The first movie immediately showed us we have a new man on the horizon here, and someone to watch. And you know, that happens once in a while with films. It's very rare, though, I think, to happen always in the first film.
Film critic Roger Ebert said in a review for the film, quote, Seagal doesn't look or sound like a professional actor either, but he's effective in his film debut. Is he indeed Hollywood's hottest new action star? Who knows, but he has the stuff, end quote. TV Guide said in their review, quote, Seagal in his big debut as an action hero makes a big splash. He is more reminiscent of Clint Eastwood than of muscle-bound Stallone or Schwarzenegger, end quote. With a nice profit on the film and the glowing reviews of Seagal's debut, Warner Brothers was quick to sign Steven to another picture. This time, they signed Seagal's new wife, Kelly LeBrock, to co-star with her husband. Hard to Kill went into production in late 1989. Things didn't stay bright for the new action star for long, though.
Director Bruce Malmuth.
I was coming into a situation where there was heat on Steven, and there was some magic and high hopes for developing the career.
On-set trouble between Seagal and director Bruce Malmuth would mark the beginning of a trend on Seagal films that he was hard to work with.
Tension mounted on the set.
We had a few differences of opinion, but nothing that impeded the film, or nothing that couldn't be handled with a conversation or, talking it out a little bit.
Hard to Kill sees Seagal as Mason Storm, an LA detective that after a failed sting on the mob, leaves Mason in a 7-year coma. After unexpectedly awakening from his coma, Mason Storm is a force to be reckoned with as he comes for his retribution. The movie opened February 9th, 1990, to a budget of $10 million and brought in a little over $47 million. The reviews were in, and they were loving the second outing of Seagal's. TV Guide said, quote, "As an actor, Seagal shows improvement in refining his low-key persona and gravelly, soft-spoken delivery. In fact, Seagal may be no more than a film or two away from filling Clint Eastwood's shoes outright," end quote. Despite the box office numbers and the reviews, Seagal hated the film.
Thank God and thank my luck, I've got enough clout in the business to be able to kind of redirect my career into the directions that are meaningful to me.
Warner Brothers, realizing the golden goose they currently had, they were quick to sign Seagal to Marked for Death, which released in October of 1990, making Seagal a back-to-back box office hit in the same year. Directed by Dwight H. Little, director of Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, and Free Willy, the film is about a DEA agent, John Hatcher, and after an undercover op goes south, Hatcher retires, but not for very long. A gang of Jamaicans are in Hatcher's hometown, dealing drugs and guns. Hatcher is going to hit the gang where it hurts most and leave them marked for death. It was the first movie that Steven Seagal and Julius R. Nassau would produce together. Remember Mr. Nassau because he'll become a major player later on. Marked for Death performed favorably for Seagal in terms of personal reviews and box office numbers, but behind-the-scenes troubles caused Seagal to become disenfranchised with parts of the industry.
But there was trouble from the get-go. Steven was unhappy with the creative direction of the film.
People are sick and tired of seeing the same thing over and over again. And when I write, I particularly try to come up with a fresh angle.
Mainly the fact that he claims that he rewrote 93% of the script, everything except the title.
Seagal decided to rework the screenplay himself.
And the next thing you know, he's rewriting more of it. And then before you know, he feels he rewrote the whole thing. He had a figure of 93%, which is probably everything but the title.
Even Seagal supposedly fought to change the name.
I hate Marked for Death as a title. I hate that even more.
He went to the Writers Guild and appealed and said, I deserve a writing credit. The Writers Guild did not give it to him.
Marked for Death made over $11 million opening weekend and went on to bring in just under $58 million worldwide. TV Guide's review for the film is an enigma, much like the man himself. Quote, "As a showcase for the martial arts skills of Seagal, the film is quite entertaining. His odd multiracial looks, he could easily play a European, a Japanese, or a Latin American, and his ponytail atop a football player's frame give him an odd star power, and that power works to the advantage of the film," end quote. USA Today said, quote, "In action thrillers, the destination counts less than the trip, and with Seagal, you're guaranteed a breakneck ride," end quote. With 3 very successful films under Steven's belt, both in terms of box office and reviews, it seemed that Seagal was on top of the world. But that high wouldn't last for long. 1991 would be a hell of a year for Seagal, starting with the March 91 GQ article titled "Black Belt, White Lies."
Seagal wasn't nearly as popular in the press. In March 1991, reporter Alan Richman wrote an unflattering story on Seagal for GQ magazine.
Alan Richman kind of backhanded Seagal and kind of questioned his talent and his abilities and his history.
The GQ story was the first of many articles to question the reality of Seagal's shrouded past.
The hit piece in Seagal's words was written by Alan Richman. The article starts with, quote, "Steven Seagal, the reigning stud of movie mayhem, seems as colorful as a character from Pulp Fiction. Perhaps he is," end quote. He continues, "It is time to suspend reality and enter the mystical and not entirely verifiable world of Steven Seagal. We are traveling into a dimension somewhere between imprecisions and exaggerations, nowhere near outright falsehoods, but to a place where prudent speech would not go." Richman then quotes one of Seagal's friends, who happens to be a psychologist, who admits, quote, "I don't always know where he's coming from," end quote. Richman goes on to bring up Michael Ovitz, Quote, Michael Ovitz of Creative Arts Agency, an admirer of the martial arts, told Terry Samel, CEO of Warner Brothers, he should put Seagal in the movies, end quote. Richman then says, with Schwarzenegger moving on, Stallone not knowing where to go, and Chuck Norris never quite there, the action-adventure market was crying out for a hero, and there he was. 6'4", dressed in black, with a glistening ponytail, slanted eyes seemingly from the Russian steppes, a profile like a hood ornament on a vintage Pontiac, with the natural arrogance of a man who has power and understands it, end quote. Allen goes on to say that the first 3 films Seagal did were all very similar. Quote, that's because Seagal insists on being overlord of all that he does, end quote. Arnold Kopelson, a producer on Steven's film Out for Justice, says this about Steven's ways. Quote, every frame of this movie has Steven's imprimatur on it, which is not the case with most actors I've worked with. I would expect that to some people on my production, he's also a pain in the ass, end quote. While Allen was interviewing Steven, he had this to say about his films. Quote, he has seen all of Akira Kurosawa's early films, the ones that capture the essence of the Japanese samurai spirit, and expects someday to make films as wonderful as these, end quote. And in 2022, we are still waiting for those films. While promoting Out for Justice, Seagal was doing an interview with Arsenio Hall discussing how he had wanted the movie to have a different title, claiming he was tired of 3-word titles.
Talk about the movie?
Something easier.
Okay, we'll be right back with Steve. You've done movies entitled Above the Law, Hard to Kill, Marked for Death. When are you going to do a 4-word movie?
Well, in this movie, that title wasn't a title that I was fond of. And I can remember sort of trying to lobby my title with Warner Brothers, and they felt that title was better for them.
What was your title?
The Price of Our Blood, which is a sort of a more mafia title.
This is also the interview where Arsenio asks about the GQ article. Seagal starts by saying he hated the article.
Let's start with the GQ article. What did you think of that?
Well, I hated it. I hated it intensely.
Then claims that Alan Richman only wrote the article to use Seagal's expose as a stepping stone for his career.
What mostly did you hate about it?
Well, I think that, you get into situations where people who are trying to, make a shot somehow, take a shot to, get somewhere, at our expense, do that all the time. They've done it to you. They've done it to every star I know. And all I can say is, this guy is like a 5'2" fat little, male, and that's his shot at me. That's how he can beat me up,
Seagal claims that Alan misrepresented himself when interviewing Steven's family and friends.
And, he misquoted all my friends, and he was out to crucify me, and he did. But he misrepresented himself to all of us. When we had a talk earlier, you've had the same thing happen.
Absolutely.
I'm your fan, man. I love you, man. I want to do this good piece, and,
When Arsenio starts by saying the title of the article, Seagal is quick to say that he resents the title.
Yeah, they call the article Black Belt White Lies.
Yeah, I resent that,
But when Arsenio asks him why, Steven sidesteps the question, and then at the end of his response says,
why?
Because, I don't understand why this person would say something like that. I want to know what I lied about,
Next, Arsenio asks about what white lies Alan Richman may have told. Seagal does not give any examples.
Tell me about the things that he said. What white lies did he tell?
Well, first of all, all of the people that he quoted, from Jerry Orbach to everybody else in the article, they're friends of mine who have a lot of really nice things to say about me, who like me a lot.
Arsenio next asks about Steven's then-wife, Kelly LeBrock.
How you are about Kelly LeBrock, his wife. I know how you get about her.
Then brings up a section in which Alan Richman sat down with Kelly and their 2 young kids.
Does it bother you even more when she's lied on, or was she lied on? Because, well, first of all, there was something, they described something about in relationship to Kelly and the baby or something being there.
Steven then lies during the interview saying,
Yeah, I mean, I asked you all, would a man refer to a baby crying as a baby squalling with the smell of diapers? Is that a man to you? You understand? What kind of person is that? You know?
Yeah.
You understand?
pause for a moment and dive back into the article in question and shed some light on what Alan Richman wrote. It's best that we use the whole paragraph for context. Quote, I am sitting with LeBrock in a 2-bedroom suite at the Hotel Bel Air, and all is not in harmony. The squalling baby Dominic, too loud to ignore. The daughter Annalisa is too cute to ignore. Smells linger in a neary amalgam of diapers and herbal teas. Quote, ungodly shit, end quote, says Seagal of his teas, end quote. Now, nowhere in the article did Alan Richman make such outrageous comments about Seagal's child. Jerry Orbach, who co-starred in Out for Justice and also friend of Seagal's, and one of the very people that Seagal said to Arsenio Hall was taken out of context, says, quote, Steven plays himself very well, although I don't think he can get up and do King Lear next week, end quote. There's another quote from the psychologist friend of Steven. Dr. Frager said this about Seagal's lies, quote, a part of Steven lived in Japan so long that he is Japanese, and in Japan, the literal truth is not as important as the emotional truth, end quote. Finally, Horgan, an ex-Foreign Service officer, said this, quote, there are bullshitters and there are pathological bullshitters, and Seagal is neither one. I exaggerate sometimes to make a story better or to get a point across, and Steven might be the same. He joins the human race in that area, but he has no vision of himself that isn't true, end quote. The article brings up Seagal's alleged security and bodyguard work for people such as Bishop Desmond Tutu. Arsenio brings up a quote from Kelly in the article in which she says Seagal was, quote, like an alien, end quote, on their first date.
He also mentioned something about Kelly's first date with you, saying, I guess he quoted her as saying you were like an alien. Which I can understand, because you're acting like an alien right now. You know, but no, I'm just kidding. No, did she say that?
What are you laughing at, man?
Steven sidesteps the question and talks about how she was misquoted and that the answers were taken so far out of context that she doesn't know what she really said.
Did she say that or anything like that?
Well, what she said to me is similar to what everyone else that was quoted, and that is that he took everything that she said out of context, and that it's really hard to tell anymore because it isn't the way she said it. You know?
Steven's ego begins to show as the interview goes on, claiming that his fans don't want to read that garbage, and that he would stop doing interviews, but then the fans would lose out because of it.
You know, they're going to do it no matter what, and that's what I say to all my friends that are hurt and concerned about this, and that is that I would rather not do any more interviews, just like you and just like all the rest of us. We're all getting sick of it, you know? And then the fans really end up losing because they don't want to, if they see my picture on the cover of a magazine because they love me, they don't want to pick it up and read that garbage about me.
During this interview, Arsenio brings up a rumor that Seagal would be hosting SNL. Seagal tries to make a joke, but when they don't land with Arsenio or the audience, you can see the error in having him host.
Hey, that they just got a date for you to do Saturday Night Live to host it?
Apparently.
Are you going to do that?
Yeah, why not?
Have you ever done comedy?
Yeah, I used to do stand-up.
Stop, Steven, stop.
It's a joke.
You're
That's
too
my
serious.
first attempt at comedy right there, and I failed, so maybe I better not do the show.
No, I think you'll be fine, because you usually do anything you set your mind to, but you're just so intense. I can't see you with the church lady in a dojo.
Well, I told them that they're going to have to, like, come up with some real intense for me, you know?
Yeah.
April 20th, 1991, saw Steven Seagal hosting SNL for the first and last time. The disaster that was the week leading to the episode and the aftermath has made Seagal known as the worst host in SNL history.
What was the biggest disaster you witnessed? Were you there for Steven Seagal?
Yes.
You were?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Oh, for those who don't know, he is widely and unanimously, that's the same thing, right? Widely and unanimously considered the worst host in the history of SNL.
I was there when he hosted SNL, one of the most famous nightmare, like, can't re-show that show ever.
Dana Carvey talked to Howard Stern about his experience working with Seagal.
And we wrote it. We did it at read through,
And all of it was them making fun of Steven. Like,
Right.
Arnold is stronger than you. He could flick you with your little baby finger and you would fly across the room and land in your own baby poop. You know, it's all this stuff.
Yeah.
Your little spindly arms. And so your buttocks are like marshmallows. You're lucky we don't have a campfire here. And he's just reading his lines and not really reacting to it.
Right.
Then it gets on the show. It's picked. Then on Thursday, we're just on the soundstage rehearsing it. And we go through it with the cue cards. He reads his lines, very serious. Then he just walks off. He's like 50 feet away in the 8H, the studio. No one's around. I go, we got to start again. Kevin, I'll go see what's going on. So I went up to him. I said, Steven, are you okay? And he didn't look at me. He's looking straight forward. He goes, quote, and this is a quote. I just wish Arnold was here so I could kick his fucking ass.
So what does that mean? He didn't understand the sketch?
Well, I told him, I said, they're idiots. Doesn't mean you're weaker than Arnold. These guys just worship Arnold. So we rewrote it. I don't know if he ever saw it. Maybe.
You mean you couldn't explain to him that in the sketch you guys love Arnold Schwarzenegger, so he couldn't make fun of himself?
So we did the sketch different so that there's only one person stronger than Arnold, and that's Steven Seagal.
But it doesn't work.
I know. Well, 6 months later, I run into Arnold at a restaurant in Santa Monica. He's got his whole gang with him.
Right, he travels with him.
He's got a foot-long cigar. He's leaning back. I go, Arnold, Steven Seagal's on the show. He said, kick your fucking ass. I told him the whole story.
Yeah.
And Arnold just leans back and goes, is that the fact?
Another SNL alum, Bob Odenkirk, recounts his experience working with Seagal and helping to write the Hans and Franz skit.
Well, it was Hans and Franz.
Right.
And we were talking to him about I was helping with Hans and Franz that week. Yeah, I didn't usually help with that piece, but I love those guys. And Seagal read it and he said, if I do this sketch, if I do it. And they want to fight him. Hey, we'll take you on. He goes, if I do it, I have to beat them up. Like he has to, it's like a John Wayne thing, right? Like,
right.
Like
He's
it's
got to
the
win.
most ludicrous scenario. You don't worry. No one will think that no one's thinking anyone beat anyone up here. But that was his attitude the whole week was he kept saying, I've never seen your show. I don't know what you do here.
Bob Odenkirk went on to talk about how Steven wrote the final skit of the show. The skit was in essence a mini version of one of Seagal's films, even with the shoehorned environmental message.
And he wrote a scene, Howard. He wrote a scene, and it's the last scene in the show, and it's like one of his movies, but they tried to do it live. They got some stuntmen to come in. It's insane. So there's like this board of directors. There's a bunch of stuntmen in suits. So as a viewer, you're like, who are these actors? They're not in the cast. And then there's like some speech, and then he enters the banquet room and starts beating. It's live. And he's beating them up and throwing them around the room. And it goes on for like 8 minutes. It's the longest scene you've ever seen. And then at the very end, he turns to camera and says,
this is what happens when you pollute the planet.
And the audience is mystified.
David Spade, when asked in an interview about the show, kind of defends the man.
Maybe his 1-inch ponytail was too tight that night because...
Wait, you're defending him?
A little bit.
Why?
Only because... You
liked his ideas.
He was friendly enough to me. The only thing he did, which was he tightened up, which is a lot of hosts do. I don't know if you did it.
David then explains what he believes to be the reason for the horrible performance.
You have to sort of trust these 30 people you don't know. You have to walk in and say...
100%.
A lot of people think we're there to make fun of them. And we're saying we respect you. If we're getting you on the show to host, we all want it to work.
Yep.
And if you make fun of yourself, this is where it gets tricky. If you make fun of yourself, it will benefit you, and we promise you. And if you don't, and you fight it so much, and that was him. He was too cool and had his image. And, like Stallone would come on, whoever would come on and they make fun of Rocky. That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
And then people go, oh, you're a human. You play so cool, but you can at least goof around. And and it's more relatable. He wouldn't do kung fu fighting as a cold open or a monologue, and it was like everybody was going. But we had it something funny, then he throws in little kicks, you know?
It would have been amazing.
It was amazing.
It would have
just
been amazing.
Because, and then I think we walk up and get kicked and fall down. And so he says he'll do it, but he just talks it. It's still kind of funny, but he won't.
Forgive me for being a little bit serious, but it's important to me to let you know that there's a lot more to Steven Seagal's retirement. Well, there was a funky Chinaman.
The episode was so horribly received that it has never been aired since its original run, and that it is next to impossible to find in a legitimate manner. The following month didn't see Seagal's public image improve any when 3 female Warner Brothers employees came forward to accuse Seagal of sexual harassment, which we will go into later in more detail. Even with everything in the press about Seagal, his fans did not seem fazed. Out for Justice performed well, bringing in $40 million worldwide.
Seagal's fans were unfazed by the negative publicity.
The thing about Steven Seagal is the media has attempted to paint a picture of him that he is not a well-liked person, that people hate him. The truth of the matter is he has an extremely loyal following.
1992 would see Seagal reach blockbuster levels with the release of Under Siege. Seagal in a 1992 interview talks about wanting to make Under Siege, quote,
on my part, it's a picture that, I ended up doing, and wanting to make it one cut above, the normal action milieu, and certainly not wanting to be involved in a cartoon.
Under Siege would be Seagal's biggest box office hit, bringing in a worldwide gross of $156 million. Under Siege saw an ensemble cast including Tommy Lee Jones and Gary Busey.
Looking for Tommy Lee Jones and Gary Busey, or how did they come into it?
Well, quite frankly, I didn't have the project. This is a project that Warner Brothers had tried to get me to do for years, and I had turned it down numerous times. And when it became apparent that I was going to make it, we sat down and we cast it. And
the movie would see Seagal testing out his acting chops as something other than a police officer. This time, he would be a cook. A lowly cook.
You like some special forces guy or something?
I'm just a cook.
A cook?
Just a lowly cook.
Roger Ebert in his review of the film said, quote, I walked into the screening in a cynical frame of mind, but then a funny thing happened. The movie started working for me. The formula is obvious. Die Hard goes to C. The cast is effective. The star Steven Seagal, who cut off his ponytail to play a former Navy hero serving out his last tour. Seagal makes a convincing cook. He can hit a target with a carving knife at 20 paces, and he even looks like he's put on a few pounds for the job, end quote. Mick Lasella of the San Francisco Chronicle says in his review, quote, with a movie like this, we know what's going to happen. The fun is seeing how it happens. Under Siege is a lot like Die Hard moved to a battleship, end quote.
In October 1992, 40-year-old Steven Seagal nailed his first genuine blockbuster with the release of Under Siege.
Despite the spectacular performance in theaters, Seagal was wanting more. Seagal signed a deal to produce, direct, and star in On Deadly Ground in the spring of 1993.
In this land of frozen beauty, where a proud people make their home, Aegis Oil is making a killing.
People here want to talk about the poisons in their...
And now, he's here. Steven Seagal is on deadly ground.
You're an oil man.
But I put out the fire.
Seagal had wanted to balance the violence on screen with a commentary on the evils of environmental pollution. Seagal in an interview talks about how he wrote his ecological ideals into the film.
Pollution.
The ecological beliefs in my life are what's in the film because I wrote them into it. And will try to lead a life that personifies my beliefs in every way I can.
Can you paint us a picture in your words as to what the film's about?
Well, I mean, basically, I think it's about the responsibility that mankind should have for one another and for the planet Earth. And when we decide to ourselves that we want to take on that responsibility, there's always a great dilemma of how to do something about it. And I think the picture's also trying to educate the people as to a lot of problems that I don't think they were aware of, because they've been sort of hoodwinked, and a lot of these atrocities towards mankind and nature have been done in a very surreptitious and clever way. And so it's educational in the sense that you see an action movie that's certainly couched in, a great story and good drama with a lot of action, but also within that there's this monster lurking in the background that we all know is a real thing. And in the end, in my opinion, it's not only what's going on, but what we need to try.
The film opened February 18th, 1994, to some of the worst reviews Seagal had seen up to this point in his career.
It was a little too message-laden. Do we deal with environmentalism? Do we deal with the dishonesty of the oil companies? Do we deal with corporate greed?
With Seagal's last film getting panned in the press, Seagal, wanting to stop the bleeding from his hemorrhaging career, was quick to make a sequel to Under Siege 2. Under Siege 2, Dark Territory. The film, lacking the star power of Tommy Lee Jones or Gary Busey, saw a sharp decline in box office returns. Seagal saw another scathing article with John Connolly's Man of Dishonor from Spy magazine in August of '95. The article claims that on the set of Marked for Death, Steven Seagal tried to enlist the help of Robert Strickland, a retired contract agent for the CIA, to perform a hit on Gary Goldman. Gary Goldman was an ex-mercenary who had been collaborating on a screenplay with Seagal and had had a falling out over money and screenplay credits. This falling out upset Seagal to the point that he had hired private investigators to track Goldman's every move. Seagal then proceeds to pull a dossier out of a drawer along with an attaché case containing $50,000. Seagal says to Strickland, quote, "I'd like you to kill Gary Goldman." And when a stunned Strickland replies with, "You're crazy," Seagal then says, quote, "If you won't do it, get someone who will. Pay him what you want and keep the rest," end quote. It wasn't enough that Strickland had denied Seagal's request. For months afterwards, Seagal repeated the request until early the next year when Seagal told Strickland that Goldman had left the country. Goldman did go to the Philippines in early 1990 and did not return for 2 years. The LAPD looked into the affair. Connolly's article mentions that in the summer of 1991, Seagal had had a top-level security consultant fly from Washington, D.C. to New York at the behest of Steven. The consultant was picked up at the airport by a limousine, then driven to Seagal's Staten Island home, where he was ushered inside to meet Seagal and business partner Julius Nassau. The reason for this meeting? Seagal wants the consultant to set up Alan Richman, the writer of the GQ expose Black Belt, White Lies. Seagal doesn't like the way Richman portrayed him. At this point, Seagal had already been on the Arsenio Hall show. Seagal tells the consultant that Richman is a, quote, end quote, in the actor's words, and wants Richman set up with a homosexual so that Seagal can, quote, get pictures of Richman going down on another man, end quote. Seagal says that he will use the photos to ruin Richman's career. The security consultant refuses. Seagal, being a man that will not take no for an answer, asks what it will take for him to whack a certain man from Chicago. Again, Seagal was told he was crazy and refused. Connolly comments on how Seagal has distanced himself from his Jewish side, bringing up that Seagal's father was Jewish and that his family pronounces their last name normally as Seagal. Seagal had told Strickland that he married Miyako Futanani to avoid the draft. However, in 1991, Seagal told Movie Line that he had married Futanani because she was pregnant. Seagal's money troubles. He arranged for a soldier of fortune friend of his to steal Kelly LeBrock's Porsche Carrera for the insurance money. Seagal later told the LA Times that he tried to catch the thief. One of Seagal's friends, Mark Makita, who ran a dojo in LA and has known Seagal since his days as an instructor, says that on at least 2 occasions, a flat broke Seagal disappeared for a week, only to return flush with cash. The claim has been corroborated by Joe Hames. Seagal once returned with a new car and $100 bills stacked 6 inches high. Seagal then boasted how he had done a hit for the mob. Connolly writes, quote, after a 6-month-long investigation, Spy concluded that Seagal is not simply a fraud, a liar, a coward, and a bully, but also a one-time bigamist who on at least 2 occasions said he wanted to contract out a murder, who had settled a nasty sexual harassment claim, and who, not surprisingly, hires and does business with people having ties to organized crime. Almost everything you have bothered to read about Seagal is a lie, end quote.
So I called him. Oh man, I can't tell you half of the stories. But yeah, I think he got a blowjob the first time we talked, which was weird.
Like while talking?
Yeah, while talking.
Oh my gosh.
This tall guy with his hair slicked back with a ponytail, Steven Seagal. And he was given a piece of every movie that they did. Money was coming in from, I don't know how they get it out, but what they do there, but money was coming in. He said, Savvy, this ain't the movies. The guy, when he went in the back room, was hysterical, crying. 2 agents had to hug him.
I don't want to sound terrible because
Well, you're above the law.
I used to be a police officer.
Oh yeah, that's true.
But I don't care about the law.
He produced all the Seagal movies. Well, the last couple of movies, Seagal had his way with young teenage girls in 3 states. There's rape warrants for him. So he gets in touch with Putin. He wants a Russian citizenship. He's over there now. Did you know that?
Here's Steven Seagal in court.
Over when an armored vehicle rolled through here. On board that vehicle, actor Steven Seagal. He was taking part in a raid.
But you obviously spend a lot of time in Russia, you spend a lot of time in America, you're making films and so forth. And in terms of your life in America, you've been very much caught up in all the allegations of sexual harassment. You had a rape allegation against you, and I wonder how you deal with all that.
Yeah.
Hello, Steven Seagal.
Take the microphone off you. Yeah.
Steven Seagal there, and of course, although we didn't